Almost every plant manager, business owner, operations leader that I've ever worked with has pretty much had the same fear that if they don't follow up, if they don't check in, that things are going to fall apart. And I think, that fear is rational, right? Especially if you're talking about an owner or somebody that's been in a leadership position that has, a lot of ownership stake in the ultimate results of the business. And what I would say, though, is, what they don't realize is that the checking, the follow-up, it's actually part of the problem. And it's counterintuitive because it's not that you shouldn't care. And sometimes people hear that, but it's the fact that you haven't built the systems yet to allow your business to operate without you. Meaning that you don't have any feedback loops built in. You're always out seeking information, which is why you tend to hear things like, I can't delegate because if I don't follow up or I don't check in, these things don't get done. And so, another aspect of that, and I've written about this previously, but another aspect of that is sometimes you have folks that are in leadership or ownership who feel a tremendous sense of value by contributing. And so when you start to talk to them or they get interested in systemization and, developing people, building their culture, they say a lot of the right things. This is the stuff that they want. They want to be able to take a week, 2 week, 3 weeks of vacation. They want their business to continue to grow without having, every single input influenced by them. But ultimately, as you start to build that, they really struggle with the letting go because that's kind of a lot of their identity. And so there's a lot of, kind of self-work or self-reflection, however you want to, clarify it or classify it. But there's a lot of that goes into, what's underneath, right? What's actually driving these activities. So again, it's not about, not caring, not wanting to be involved, because it can go, to the opposite of that as well, in terms of, not providing, enough kind of direction, right? Enough clarity, which we're going to unpack here in a couple of minutes, but what some of the ramifications are from that. So again, you think that from a leadership perspective or maybe ownership perspective, that you're providing a lot of flexibility and the ability for people to influence and ultimately drive improvements forward. But that can create, an equally challenging environment if you're doing that with other folks that don't naturally understand exactly how or what they should be doing to, move the needle forward, right? So I share that story, I have in the past through my own lens, kind of telling the story of how, I'll never forget walking into my first supervisory or operations leadership role and kind of knowing like generally what I was there for, right? Like influence the outcomes of the business, right? Like do all of the things to kind of, positively impact what's happening in the business and, drive improvement forward, right? But it's like, I talk about that through the lens of like, so what? Like, what am I supposed to do tomorrow with that, right? Like, and there's generally not an answer. So some people really excel in those environments. Some people are able to figure it out over time, and other people, really struggle. So, it's not just enough to say that, you've got to build systems so, your business can operate without you. You have to understand what's inside of you as an ops leader, as a business owner, that is kind of pushing this agenda, right? Because if you're not prepared for it, if you're the type of person that thrives on being needed, you're going to struggle unless while you're doing that, you also do some work internally, right? So again, maybe that's not an issue. Maybe you are willing and ready to let go and you don't want to be involved in every single aspect. But then, if there's not enough structure, right? Like you can go to the opposite side of that, or you can have people that you're telling, these things to, right? Like we want to build out these systems. We want to allow you to, be able to execute and do things without me being a, primary roadblock. And they may be thinking to themselves like, oh, I don't know if I'm ready for that. Like, I don't even know what that means. I don't know when I should come to you, when I should be doing it on my own. So that's what makes this stuff, simple, not easy, right? I talk about this all of the time. And why, the typical answer is, well, it depends, and why is it, why do I bring value? Because my lens of experience is a lot wider than most people's. So that's what allows me to kind of understand all of the different dynamics, all of the different, personality traits, ultimately what the resource pool we have to pull from. And then, like, what are we trying to do here, right? Like, how are we trying to grow this business? All of that starts to then influence, like, what are those first steps forward, right? How do we crawl, walk, run? And so I wanted to kind of set the stage with all of that because there's a lot of content out there about, you just got to do these 5 things to, systemize your business. Or, if it's, somebody that, has developed and is ultimately selling you software, right? That's the solution. You gotta buy this software and that's what's going to help you, drive the systemization efforts in your business. Right. Again, those things can be true. But for me, what really ends up coming down to it is, who is involved, right? The people that are involved, how they think about their role, how they kind of value the interaction that they have or the parts that they are truly needed for in the business. And that's what starts to really shape how this stuff comes to be. I was in a call with a client earlier, and the owner actually had a really great way to to kind of encapsulate a bit of what I'm saying here. And yes, growth comes down to the tactical things, but beyond that, what it really is built upon is the culture, right? It's the trust amongst the team and throughout the org, right? And when I say across the team, I'm talking about, the leadership team, and then obviously across the org down to the individual contributors. And if not everybody understands how they influence that, it is going to be really challenging, right? To build systems, to create accountability, to have, trust at the deepest level, throughout and across your organization. So, I'm sure everybody has worked in a scenario. Anybody that's listening to this has either worked in a scenario, maybe this is you as a business owner or an operations leader, but, has worked in a scenario where they have somebody in a leadership position or a management role that, can't take a vacation without getting a tremendous amount of phone calls. Right. And it's interesting because some people look at that and say, wow, they're just, really dedicated, right? Like, they're always checking emails, they're always touching base with the team. Like, man, how integrated they are to their organization or operation. But really what's underneath that from a pure, how do we build sustainable growth? How do we operate with excellence is a systems problem. I was talking to my cousin earlier this week, and he owns an auto repair business, and so he happened to be on a trip with a couple of his buddies, and one of his buddies owns several car dealerships in the area. And he was telling me about, basically that, this person was kind of constantly on the phone to the point where, it was 6 holes of, golf there out in Arizona. We're, in Michigan. So for anybody that's, not familiar, but, they're taking a little reprieve from our Michigan spring. And so they were in Arizona. And so they're out on the golf course, and, for 6 holes, this person was dealing with, work problems, right? And understanding, this particular situation. And, it was really kind of, letting them get the best of them. And so we were talking about it a little bit, and it kind of mentioned what I just said, which is, ultimately it's just it's a systems problem, right? This person probably thrives a bit on feeling needed, being in the mix, and hasn't either identified the right person, hasn't, built the systems around, the ability to kind of let go. And, it takes a tremendous amount of trust, right, to be able to do that. And it takes the right person, because, as I said, some people really, their entire identity is around kind of feeling and being needed, the one that has the answer, the one that can create the solution. And, some people on the outside may look at that and say, well, of course, like that makes sense because, they're the owner, right? It's their money. And that is true to a certain extent. But, for the majority of businesses that are out there that are actively trying to grow, in a more traditional sense, right? You have to do that you have to hire people, you have to build systems, in order to be able to do that. So, that bit of letting go, has to, be built in, right? Otherwise, there will be a plateau, because you as an individual, you will be the, sole bottleneck, right? Every decision, every, I've talked about this before, teams that feel like, well, if I make a decision, I'm wrong. If I wait to talk to you about a decision, I'm wrong. There's never any winning in that scenario. So again, that's a bit of unpacking some of the issues through a couple of stories that, have happened recently, and, kind of what the start of some of that is. And for a lot of the folks that I talk to that kind of fall into those buckets, right? A lot of leadership folks that I talk to that fall into those buckets, they love to talk about, getting right to the accountability piece, right to holding people accountable for whatever is happening, right, throughout the organization. And the problem I find often is that, look, we definitely have to hold people accountable. But what I come across most often is that we've not actually created enough clarity around a particular situation. And sure enough, when I probe, people tell me, like, oh, Joe's not doing what we need. It's like, oh, really? Tell me about that. Like, how does Joe know what to do? It's like, well, what do you mean? How does he know what to do? He I talk to him all the time about it. Everybody around him's doing what, we expected Joe to do. And it's like, well, like, when's the last time you talked to him about it? How did that conversation go? Like, did you, give him a clear expectation? Does he understand? Are there any metrics side to it? Like, a lot of times what's underneath all of that is some, kind of passerby comments, no, formal documentation. It's just this series of, kind of maybe things that are said in a group, or maybe things that are kind of said, in a backhanded way that it's, kind of maybe a joke. And so people aren't sure, like, well, is this serious? Am I, boy, if I was really doing that, I would think that somebody would, pull me aside and let me know and kind of show me the detail, and then explain to me, like, okay, how do I get from A to B? Right. There's like this classic scenario that happens in, like sales, right, or go to market around, like I was talking to this rep. This happened a long time ago, but it's like a great illustration of this same type of thought process, right? And the situation was that this particular rep was really struggling to, get initial sales calls, right? And so he went to his boss and was kind of explaining, and his boss is like, oh, what do you mean? I set all these calls, and I do all of this, and all the other people do all of this. Like, you should be able to do it. But when it came down to it, what this person was really asking for was kind of step-by-step guidance. can I sit in with you to see how you're able to do that so I can learn, so I can pick up, so I can actually perform the job, as intended. And what pretty quickly happened, right, was like, the leadership person wasn't able to do that. And, they were talking a really good game, but they weren't backing it up with, any action, which meant that they didn't have the skill set, nor could they actually go through and show this person how to start, landing actual calls. Right. So it's like, here you've got somebody that's getting frustrated because they're from the leadership perspective, they're frustrated with the team member because the output isn't there. The team member goes and solicits help. In this case, it was like a proactive thing, right? Like the team member goes and solicits help and, it still gets met with resistance. And, ultimately, right, like what happens in that scenario? The leadership person's like, oh, we got to hold Joe accountable. Joe doesn't know what the hell he's doing. And, the person is sitting there like, man, I would love to do this, right? Like I want to try. And sometimes when I'm sharing stories like this, I'll hear, pushback from somebody in leadership. And it's like, well, I mean, that's not always the case. And, they know, and we've given them help and, it's not that hard. And, they just don't want to do it, or they have, they just don't care. And yeah. Right. There's definitely people that don't care. There's definitely people that aren't interested in, learning and growing and contributing. But it is such a small number of people. Like, I should really try to figure out how many people I've been around, whether directly led, indirectly led, have worked with, right? To give you like a better quantifiable number here, but it's just like, it's such a small amount of people that just really wake up and see what kind of disruption they can create. And generally, even with those people, I find there's some sort of, underlying issue or reason that they're doing it, right? It's not just like built into them, So my whole entire point with this is just like the majority of people we're going to hire, to lead, to run into in our lives are not intentionally trying to cause chaos. But chaos just happens because there's not a lot of clarity. Because there's not a lot of clarity, is really difficult to be consistent, right? And then the problem is that everybody wants to jump to the accountability piece and, it feels very arbitrary. And that's exactly what happens in, the majority of companies that I'm working with that are struggling with these things, right? Even companies that are doing really amazing things in terms of moving the needle still struggle with, building trust over the long term, still struggle with, like the core identity of, if I'm not involved, am I even needed? Is my worth, less? Right? People struggle with this stuff. So, don't feel alone if you're out there and you're listening to this and you're hearing some of, what happens in your day to day, because this stuff is everywhere, and it's the things that, that I'm in a lot of conversations with a variety of, sized orgs, service-based businesses, manufacturing business, right? Like there is no, it's universal. Let's just say it that way, right? Like it's a universal issue that folks are experiencing, right? And again, I think a lot of it is driven, if I had to dig down to the root cause of, what created all of this, I think, and I've talked about this in a couple of different lenses, but I believe that the real root cause with all of this is the fact that, we're kind of like trained and ingrained to seek efficiency, right? And it's always within our own little area of responsibility. And we're all trying to create, I wish I remember where I heard this specific phrasing from. But, it's this idea that we're all trying to elevate our status, right? And we do that in a variety of ways. And when people, have to come to you for answers, that's a way to, elevate your status. That's why I'm always trying to talk about and constantly share with people like, look, you don't need to buy anything from me. Okay. That to me is like the best sales pitch ever, right? Like I literally give away all the things I tell people that pay me money for free. It's like, there's no secret to it. It's probably like, the worst business model possible, but it's not, because this stuff is simple, not easy. And so because you've gone through it, because I've seen it in a variety of ways, it becomes a faster path to be able to move the needle, towards these, opportunities, or towards this growth, or, mitigating or reducing risk, right? It becomes a faster path to work with somebody. So it's not that you can't figure it out, it just is quicker when you work with somebody who's already done it, right? So, I touched on it a little bit, right, in terms of the kind of three core pillars that relate to this specific scenario. But, consistency is kind of, it's the glue, right? It's where most companies kind of, lose it, right? Like if they figured out clarity, then almost guaranteed consistency is where they're struggling. And the reason for that is because people, right? You've got personalities, you've got outside influences. And oftentimes what I find is that even if you have clarity, it's not necessarily the most readily accessible clarity. And so it's like, well, what does that mean, right? Well, what it really means is that, people are still making it up on the fly, right? Based on a variety of kind of circumstances and situations. So again, you may have some clarity, you may have some process documentation, you may have some procedures, you may have some, some guidance in terms of, what you should be doing. But then we kind of say like, well, that's not quite it. And well, this is going on. And so, it's, there goes our consistency, right? Like I had this situation where, as a company kind of going through this, they had some clarity, right? And they're really struggling with consistency. And what the consistency came down to was, I had to phrase it this way, right? Like they had two people that were executing, a particular process, right? And one person had been there longer. One person, kind of had gone through some of the growing pains. The other person, created some more waves, was a little bit more vocal about things because, they hadn't been there as long. They kind of had some new perspective to share. They kind of, again, were a bit more vocal about those things, right? And so what was really interesting was that, once we moved past the clarity piece and we started talking about the consistency, I kind of had to flip the script, right? Where it's like, well, if this was, it's like, oh, well, it's not a problem, right? If Bob does it that way, but it's a problem when Dave does it that way, because Dave's kind of a bit more, outspoken, and Dave's got a few more opinions about things. And Dave's not just kind of a, go with the flow and, bobblehead type. He's going to give you, a bit of insight along with it. Still going to get done, right? So does that mean that, you hold those two accountable different because, this person's been there longer, they're kind of more easygoing, easier to talk to, like don't cause as much, problems, right? And the leader in that situation was kind of, a little like, it kind of finally, resonated, right? And again, so even when there is clarity, leadership folks often struggle with the consistency because you've got more dynamics that, are getting kind of filtered into the decision-making process, right? So when we talk about systemization, we talk about creating that clarity, consistency, again, I try to explain to people, it's not about, we make it personal, right? Like that's the better way to say it. We, from a leadership perspective, we make it personal because things are personal. It's people, right? And so what I encourage people to do when they're trying to get to this consistent place, right, is like you do have to zoom out of that a little bit, right? And so there's a big difference between flexibility and inconsistency or consistency. And so you have to build in some flexibility, and that's fine, right? But it has to be process driven, so that way you don't slip from flexible to inconsistent. And that's like the fastest path to eroding trust across a team or an organization is that, well, wait a second. So it's okay when, when Sue did it, but it's not okay when I do it. Like, what? I don't think so. Right? People kind of call bullshit on that stuff, right? And that's what happens. We're not being consistent. From a leadership perspective, we classify it as we're being flexible, right? But that's not the perception. And unfortunately, when you're in a leadership role, whether you own the business or you're just in a leadership role, or you're an executive, if it's a bigger company we're talking about, right? All we do is deal in perceptions. And that's the ultimate situation that we are navigating, is what the perception is for other people. And so we have to create a consistent way to do that. And for me, that is kind of zooming out and, again, looking at it from the process and business perspective. Like when we're defining that thing, is like, what does the business need, right, to get the output required? Okay, so if we start from that lens and we don't think about it from the, Dave and Sue lens, that generally puts us in the right frame of mind to be flexible yet consistent, right? And that is, again, that's kind of like the happiest place to be, because you're actually, closing those gaps. So what I want to do as we kind of wind this episode down is, so we've got clarity, right? We've just walked through how do we actually be consistent. So now the final piece, right? How do we hold people accountable? Well, now it becomes very clear, right? Where people have gone kind of outside of the guardrails or, as the bounds and the goal, right? They're not producing the output. We've given them all of the support. We've had the conversations at a detailed level and a professional level. We've brought facts, not feelings, right? There is a place for accountability. I mean, look, I have, had to hold many people accountable throughout my career. And I can say in the early days, I probably did a terrible job at being clear and being consistent. And again, I say, like, how do you think I learned all of this stuff, right? Like, I just, screwed it up, right? So that's why I could talk about this stuff. So again, you don't need to hire me to learn it, right? Like I tell you about it. You can certainly go through a, nearly 30-year career of leading people to learn this stuff. That's a whole other way that you can get a similar education. But yeah, like that's the unfortunate part of leadership. Sometimes, it's not a good fit situation. Sometimes the output just isn't there, and you've created the clarity, you've given all of the support, you've tried to bring people along, and it just doesn't work. And that's okay, right? Like Gary Vee's got this kind of great phrase about it's hire fast, fire faster, promote the fastest, right? And I really love that because it's so simple to remember, and it really kind of illustrates, right? Like bringing people on board into your organization, you don't know really anything about them, right? No matter how much, due diligence, no matter what your hiring process or, vetting process looks like, a lot of times you just don't know until you see how they fit into the culture. And again, that's where I see a lot of businesses take a misstep where, maybe somebody has the skill set, right? But they're not a culture fit. Okay. And back to the comment that, that business owner made in the meeting earlier today, back to just this more general holistic idea of how do we build trust, right? Like culture is everything. It's the culture eat strategy for breakfast, right? And culture erodes very quickly. It is built very slowly. It erodes very quickly, just like trust. Right. So again, it's, let's bring people in. Let's, give them the benefit of the doubt. Right. But if they're not a fit, let's give them all the tools. Let's make sure we have clarity, consistency, and then ultimately, hold them accountable to the things that we need. And look, we can hold people accountable to a culture standard, assuming it's been, clear and consistently upheld. That to me fits into this same exact bucket. So, what I'll leave you with today is kind of, just to circle back to the folks that feel like they can't take a break, that they're always ingrained in every single thing that's happening, throughout their organization. For me, number one, it's like, imagine what a day would look like if you could come in and do the things that you set out to do, right? The night before, the morning of, when you got your coffee in your hand and you're thinking about what's going to unfold for the day, or what you'd really love to move forward, or maybe, a new product you'd love to do some R&D on, or maybe a marketing initiative that you'd like to support, right? Just imagine what it would be like if you weren't dragged into, the firefight, that happens in any day-to-day, type of environment, right? All of that stuff is built. The answer to get from A to B is built in, this clarity, consistency, and accountability framework. And obviously it's, much more detailed than that in terms of tactics and how we actually build out systems, how we get those, implemented. But without this infrastructure in place, you'll constantly struggle to be able to build any type of sustainable, growth over the course of time. So thanks so much, and I'll catch you on the next episode.